Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, bringing you Hermann Scherchen's craziest ever Haydn performances. It is these, the Military and Farewell Symphonies, his stereo version of the latter, not the mono version. I have to talk to you first and foremost about where to find these things, because you really got to hear them. This is the Japanese Scherchen edition that issued the two of them. These were recorded in 1958 in stereo, like as I said. Now, when Deutsche Grammophon reissued his Haydn symphonies, they put in the stereo Farewell Symphony, but left out the stereo Military Symphony. I mean, what were they thinking? And then they issued a big Scherchen box where they repeated the same error. However, salvation arrived in the form of Scribendum's Hermann Scherchen edition, which includes the stereo issues as their Haydn representations of Scherchen. And well, they should, which just goes to show that there is a brain functioning somewhere in the industry, certainly at Scribendum, but not surprisingly, not necessarily at Deutsche Grammophon. Now, why are these so special? Well, Scherchen, as you know, or may not know, so I'm going to tell you, was completely out of his mind. He was a fabulously imaginative, nutty professor of a conductor. You know, he would play anything. He played music from Frescobaldi through Xenakis, and he'd mix it all together however he wanted. He was famous for his Schoenberg. He usually, because of his interpretive wildness, and he was interpretively wild, as we will discuss. I mean, he did Beethoven up to the metronome markings way back before anybody thought it was possible. He played tons and tons of Bach, sometimes at unbelievable tempos. He did Mahler, sometimes with cuts, sometimes without. I mean, he was just a free spirit. That's what he was. And because of that, he usually did not have the best orchestras, but he didn't care. He just did everything with everybody. And if it sounded like crap, then that was the way it went. And sometimes it did. Other times, miracles happened. So, you know, you never knew what you were going to get with Scherchen. And for that reason, record collectors have always hunted down his recordings, most of which were made for the Westminster label, just because they're so much fun, even if they're not really all that good, which is often the case. These Haydn performances, they're with the Vienna State Opera Orchestra, which was sort of pieces of the Vienna Philharmonic and others on any given day, are completely sui generis. You know, it's not about idiomatic style in Haydn. Let's start with the Farewell Symphony, shall we? Now, as you know, the Farewell Symphony is called that because in the last movement, all of the players in Haydn's day would blow out their candles, which were illuminating the music and sometimes burning the music, and leave. That you get up and you walk off the stage. The intent being to inform Haydn's patron, Prince Esterházy, that the musicians were sick of being stuck at Castle Esterházy in a Hungarian swamp and wanted to go back to Vienna because their families were there, and when they were in residence in Hungary, they weren't allowed to bring their families. The wives and children had to stay home in Vienna. So they went back to Vienna because Esterházy got the point, watching his orchestra walk out one player at a time. That's the apocryphal story. Whether or not that is true, we don't exactly know. The music itself comes from Haydn's Sturm und Drang period. I mean, it's the only symphony of the entire, 18th century in the key of F sharp minor. It's a very, very unique piece of music for a whole host of reasons that have nothing to do with the slow finale, with the gradual disappearance of the orchestra. Scherchen decided that this gradual disappearance needed to be somehow represented on his recording. So what happens is, as the instruments drop out one by one, you hear voices whispering Auf Wiedersehen and footsteps going background as they fade away, one after the other. You hear these voices going, Auf Wiedersehen, Auf Wiedersehen, Auf Wiedersehen. Meanwhile, the music's playing and the footsteps are tapping. It's just demented in a good way. I mean, it's the Farewell Symphony doing its farewell thing in a way that makes it graphically audible, exactly what's going on. And possibly that's exactly what happened in Haydn's day. I'm sure they would have said goodbye, and assuming they wore hard-heeled shoes, you would have heard them walk away. It's just great. Up to that point, by the way, it's a very exciting performance of the Farewell Symphony. It's very well done. So that's great. Now, let's talk about the military. In the military symphony, the reason it's called that is because Haydn introduced military percussion. That is a bass drum, cymbals, and a triangle in the second movement, which is a march, and in the finale. It's actually more interesting, I think, that those instruments come back in the finale. The reason Haydn did it, of course, is because he had them, so he might as well use them. But more than that, this was probably the first instance in the history of music, in the history of abstract music, where percussion instruments, which symbolized literally battle, they were programmatic instruments, were used in a completely abstract way, simply as color, as nothing more than additional color and rhythm. And that was a very revolutionary thing to do, even though, I don't think listeners might have recognized it at the time. Now, contemporary accounts of the second movement, the military movement itself, are full of thrilling descriptions of how it's the thrust of battle and the screams of the wounded. One account says, rising to a climax of horrid sublimity. Well, you would never know that from most modern performances. Usually they just go tap, 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 tap with the percussion, and it's very polite and very classical, and just boring as hell. It's terrible, absolutely terrible. You would never know something significant was happening there, especially since most of the music is in a major key, as most military music was in those days. It was genuine military music, and it was optimistic because you wanted your troops to go and kill the other guys and look forward to victory. You are not going to depict the horror of war in the music that was played to inspire your troops. And so Haydn's military music is military, but that doesn't make it any less violent. And this is the most violent account of the military music you have ever heard. I mean, when those percussion instruments come crashing in, it is like a nuclear holocaust, classical style. And damn it, that's what it should sound like. That's what it's supposed to do. I mean, I once saw a performance, a live performance with Colin Davis in the Staatskapelle Dresden at Carnegie Hall, where I walked out on it. I never walk out on things, almost never. There's another time, but that's another story. I always sit through it. I couldn't bear it. It was unlistenable. It was so tame. Well, Scherchen wants you to hear the climax of horrid sublimity, and you really, really do. It's just thrilling, and because it was done in stereo, it sounds great. Now, his earlier version had nothing like this impact. For some reason, it was a much more normal interpretation. But here, he goes nuts. And that's what we listen to Scherchen for, the insanity. You got to have the insanity. And in the finale, which he gets done in under 4 minutes, it's, da 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 dum ba dum ba dum ba da dum. Well, here, the orchestra is clearly hanging on for dear life. It's it's completely, totally ridiculous in its tempo. And when the percussion comes back in at the end, and it's crash, bang, smash, it's just hilarious. It's fun. It's physical. It's what Haydn's music is supposed to be, but so seldom is these days. Even the period instrument people almost never give it the force and impact it must have had back in its day. And if you're not going to have authentic impact, then what the hell is the point of using authentic instruments? Harnoncourt actually kind of approaches it in a similar way in his battle music too. But I mean, what does it take to get conductors to make an exciting sound? Scherchen, for all of his eccentricity and for all of his wackiness, got to the essence of what this music expresses better than anybody else ever has. So I'm not saying you should have 22 or whatever it is CDs of Scherchen just for these pieces. You should have 22 CDs of Scherchen for everything else that's in here too. But if you can get this still from Japan, which you may be able to, you have to hear it one way or another, because there has never been a pair of Haydn symphony recordings anything like these. So keep on listening, folks, and thank you so much.